lot of he has been doing already 2 conferences, and he will be doing one again tomorrow in Jerusalem in the Institut Français. So he has been doing a lot, meeting a lot of professors, scholars, and also activists in Palestine to develop his ideas also concerning the situation in Palestine. So Professor Engin is professor at the Open University in London, and he has been a main, or the actor in establishing the field of citizenship studies. He's been working a lot on that issues, and he has been publishing notably two main books. One is a collective one called Acts of Citizenships. It's from 2012, where he elaborates this notion, this concept that he forged of acts of citizenship that he will be talking about today, notably. And a second book called Citizens Without Frontiers, which was out in 2012, and which is, if you receive the paper, it's part of a chapter of this book that he will be presenting. So we are very honored because our seminar has been entitled Acts of Citizenship. What kind of act of citizenship in Palestine, because of the concept that you elaborated. So we have here our guru coming. So we are very, very happy, very honored. And so I give you the floor for today's conference, which is dealing more on the issue of acts of citizenship and Orientalism. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I should also begin by thanking first Institute for Palestine Studies for hosting this event and inviting me. I'm very, very pleased to be here, delighted to be here. Like Stephanie said, it's been a whirlwind of 3 days of meeting various activists and researchers, learned a lot, exchanged a lot, and really impressed by, and really the word I'm looking for just doesn't come. It's going to it's going to make a lasting impact on me, the memories and my discussions, and we are halfway through yet, so it's been really intense. I should also thank IFPO and colleagues, Stephanie, Claire, is methodological and theoretical issues. Clearly, many of the things I say, when I'm saying them, the question of Palestine, the question of Palestinian citizenship, and the question of acts of Palestinian citizenship are in the back of my mind. But I don't immediately, and I don't want to immediately make connections to Palestinian citizenship when I'm speaking, in the first part at least, so that we can just work through some methodological and conceptual issues of why acts of citizenship, why such a phrase, what does that phrase accomplish, and what it wants to accomplish. And once one makes an investment in working with that concept, what kinds of obligations it imposes on a researcher to think through. So those are the questions that I want to address, methodological and conceptual. And then maybe in the second part we can bring examples that in other seminars that you have perhaps discussed or you want to discuss today, from specific to Palestinian question and Palestinian citizenship, and discuss in what ways actually this concept can perform something original, something useful in thinking through Palestinian citizenship. Obviously, I am convinced, and some of you are, that it can, so let's explore what those would be. Now, when we began studying various aspects of citizenship, now, from hindsight, I say that there are 3 ways of approaching citizenship, but it wasn't always that clear. Those 3 ways, as approaching citizenship as status, approaching citizenship as habitus, and approaching citizenship as acts. This wasn't always clear. Through time, it became clear that this is what we're doing. But why actually be dissatisfied with approaching citizenship as status? What is particularly lacking in that way of thinking about citizenship? Now, in the 1990s and early 2000s, when we were doing research on citizenship, the field was really dominated by people who are specialized in the technical details of what each country does in terms of defining citizenship rights. Sometimes comparing them, but not even that. Comparative work on citizenship was even scant. Most of it was really the dominant approach was in Britain. The right to privacy emerged in 1689. It has changed in 1736. It became informal, formally recognized in law such and such period. So then you would know about, you know, the history of that particular civil liberty or civil right called privacy in Britain, or entry-exit requirements, immigration regulations. All these issues that have to do with legal status of citizens, really the dominant aspect of understanding citizenship, which of course understandable. This is one of the most significant ideas, aspects of citizenship, which regulates, for example, residency, regulates entry-exit, and along with residency and entry-exit, it also regulates what then additional rights one can claim on the basis of entry, exit, and residency. Today, for example, in Europe, if you are a citizen of, let's say, Ukraine, and arrive in a member state, let's say France, upon entry, you have certain rights. But these rights are not equivalent to another person who enters into France, let's say from Belgium, because Belgium is part of the European Union. So for a Belgian citizen then is entitled to European Union rights. So entry, exit, residency, movement are interlocking complex of legal aspect of what constitutes citizenship, and clearly it's a really significant aspect of it. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, particularly sociologists, but also anthropologists, began questioning, thinking about citizenship only in these terms, because it becomes very technical. Any moment that you use the term citizenship, oh, citizenship rights, passport holding, entry, exit, that interlocking complex that I mentioned, it gets focused on that. Anthropologists and sociologists, but some political scientists have said, but citizenship is also practice. Through various ways of doing things, by practicing citizenship, people come to inhabit citizenship. They inhabit a particular subject position that invites people to think like and live like citizens. There are such things, for example, in our cultures as a concept of good citizenship. What does it mean? So, you know, a young man who gives, for example, his seat without any regulations on streetcar, in metro, to an elderly person, has already inhabited a citizenship way of living, that you respect elders, you transfer your rights to others in respect of them, and by showing this respect you inhabit a particular citizenship subjectivity. And there are many other examples. We can also push it to political realm. In political realm, for example, beyond voting, yes, voting is a legal right, but beyond voting, what it means to inhabit a subject position who has the right to vote is about being aware of political situation, making oneself knowledgeable about politics of the events and issues that surrounds one, and properly making judgment about what is right, what is wrong to do politically, and when called upon to render a judgment about a party, about a leader, and so on, that one is informed. So the anthropologists and sociologists have argued that all of this cannot be captured by these interlocking mechanisms of legal requirements of what citizenship means. Citizenship also means inhabiting this particular subject position, and we have to look at comparatively how each culture inflects this. It's different in the UK, for example, what it means to be a British citizen. Perhaps being detached from the political process is a definition of being a citizen, whereas in France, it's the opposite, being attached and engaged with the political process, until maybe very recently, is the very significant part of occupying that French conception of political subjectivity. So then, and then you can just add various other comparative issues to this. So there have been studies about these comparative aspects of inhabiting a particular political subjectivity called citizenship. Now, before I enter the third one, what maybe is lacking in here, what doesn't give us sort of a perspective that we could even deepen this, is that there is also an unresolved issue here. In either looking at citizenship as status or as subjectivity or habitus, in Western social science, the predominant assumption has been that as status and habitus, citizenship is uniquely Western phenomenon. It was in the West, it was invented, if you like, specifically during the Enlightenment, but even more broadly, sociologists such as Max Weber arguing that medieval cities were the hot bed of the particular idea of membership, loyalty, belonging, and also autonomy and rights, that citizenship really is a Western Christian phenomenon. I slipped in the Christian, particularly, although it's not explicitly said, it is implicitly assumed that Christian Western societies have invented citizenship. Now, when sociologists and anthropologists who began thinking about citizenship as habitus, when they are confronted with this question, yes, but there is citizenship in China, there is citizenship in Tunisia, there is citizenship in Turkey. These are not like hotbed of Western places. The response is, but of course they have become Westernized. In other words, they have imported the idea of citizenship, both as status and habitus, and then they incorporate it into their constitutional regimes. So if we see citizenship elsewhere today, it is only because it was at one point imported, if, of course, the word is never imposed. So there's like a discrepancy. Now, on this question, I had, with a group of researchers first assembled in Canada, I assembled two series of researchers in two big projects in Canada. One was about acts of citizenship, the other one is about citizenship and Orientalism. We began asking questions about both these assumptions, that citizenship is uniquely Western and perhaps even Christian in its origins, and that it can be found in other places only when it is imported to other places. But there isn't any indigenous, if you like. There isn't any autonomous development of political subjectivity that might approximate something that we might call citizenship, especially in terms of habitat, is actually practiced by non-citizens. The problem is that when non-citizens practice such citizenship, they get into deep trouble. They face deportation if you're a refugee, if you're an immigrant, if you're an illegal immigrant, you face imprisonment, you face curtailment of your rights, certain social rights, certain legal rights. You already lack political rights, you cannot vote, and so on. So it is the place of those who practice citizenship as non-citizens is, in one word, precarious. The precarity, vulnerability of people who engage in politics is significant, much more so than who have the legal status of citizens. So we said, this has to be addressed within citizenship theory. You cannot just simply understand citizenship on already those who have the right to, but what about those who don't have a right to and yet still do practice citizenship? And interesting confluence, there's also activism in Europe and America of those people who hold status of citizen, but they mobilize for non-citizens. So this is an interesting sort of crisscrossing. So these people are not just simply doing politics for their own interest, which is a significant aspect of citizenship, right? It's a significant aspect of citizenship not understood in liberal individualist way. That is, citizenship is as much as about the rights of yourself, the ones that you're entitled, the ones that you want to be entitled to, but also rights of others that you fight for, you struggle for. So in Europe and America, number of organizations emerge, for example, No One is Illegal, politics of citizenship without borders, those who also engage in politics of illegal aliens and their rights and so on. Now, these people don't get into trouble for engaging in that politics in the same way those who don't have the right to citizenship do. But their position also became precarious in some ways. They also face considerable punishment and so on. So then there's a complex in here that needs to be theorized, politically understood, and practically studied was the question. It is at that time we began thinking about, with the influence of Judith Butler, the concept of performativity, the concept of performance, also in theater studies and so on. We began to say, well, what happens when citizens stage citizenship? They perform citizenship. They occupy these positions, occupy legally or illegally. What happens? Don't people have right to occupy these positions when they perform them? Legal authorities increasingly felt nervous about this development in Europe and America. Because you're beginning to think about the rights of those, for example, illegal aliens, whether they have a right to vote, whether they have a right to do street protest, do they have a right to do petition, let alone do they have a right to now residency, because they perform themselves as citizens. So it became a very contentious issue. As we moved along, this performativity aspect developed to a point where we began developed this idea that in fact there is something that all these share is disobedience. We often think about status and habitus of citizenship as obedience, like within the law. How are we going to theorize disobedience as a condition of citizenship? It is an aspect of citizenship. Can we incorporate disobedience as part of citizenship? That subjects who are disobedient are also citizens and that has to be respected. Can we develop a constitutional law that can recognize this? There is, of course, particularly in American law, there's the First Amendment, and it's also protection, the Fourth Amendment, disobedience, civil disobedience as a right, as a constitutional right. Can we draw on this but also don't understand it as individualistic terms but collective terms, articulate that disobedience? So this interest in disobedience led to a particular understanding of perhaps citizenship also involves disruption. Now, violence and non-violence of disruption is negotiable. We don't necessarily have to describe at the outset, saying that, for example, violent disruption can never be considered as citizenship. But that does not mean that every form of disruption would have to involve violence. But it can be maintained as a principle that can be invoked, but it does not have to be prescribed in advance. It becomes very tricky to define that distinction. But nonetheless, there was determinants to keep that open. As a result then, we have developed this conception of enactment, which plays on two concepts of enactment, or two meanings of enactment. On the one hand, as you all know, enactment is a legal act. It clearly in law has a meaning that a law is enacted. It's a legal concept. But bringing in performativity and performance, we also inflected it on what enactment is also what happens when a particular group of individuals enact a right that they don't have, mobilize in it, for example, occupying as illegal aliens to a particular place and seek the right to residency on the basis of human rights or whatever repertoire that one draws from. But itself, it's an illegal act in that particular. So what happens with this? So then we developed, the three cardinal concepts to think with citizenship. Subjectivity, in the sense in which I articulated, political subjectivity. How does one occupy a political subject position of citizen? Secondly, performativity. How does one perform citizenship? And enactment. How does one enact citizenship when it disrupts the given order, given legal status? And then we theorize this with a little bit drawing on Hannah Arendt, beginning something new, and so on, which I'm not going to go into, but if you ask me questions, it's in the chapter.
Just a small question. The first point is, the second is performativity, the third one is
enactment,
and
yeah.
the first?
Subjectivity. I apologize, there are a number of trinities. When I reread the chapter, it's not necessarily by design, but the first trinity is the status, habitus, acts, and then the second trinity, a broader level of subjectivity, performativity, and enactment. And I hope that there isn't any more of that. It gets a bit confusing. But so the idea is then, how are we going to theorize within the given tradition of political theory, whether we draw on Arendt or any other source, acts that disrupt the current legal order? And when that disruption occurs, how do we understand the precariousness of subjects who are caught in those questions? So then, the question of how we articulated that beginning something new as a rupture. I give some examples in the chapter, but also at the end, number of acts we look. I look at, what does it mean to study an act? So I look at, for example, the man who is a environmental citizen, environmental activist. He's himself not an illegal alien, so he's duly constituted citizen, but he goes into a bidding and gets accidentally into the bidding for public lands, and he buys millions of dollars of worth of public lands to which he is not entitled to, nor can he pay for in the bidding process. Then he gets 2 years prison for that. And in his court case, he argues that he was merely practicing his amendment rights and that he should not be imprisoned, and he was just enacting civil disobedience. So I took that one example, but there are so many other examples of how does a subject, gets caught in an illegal situation and yet could be still practicing citizenship? How do we conceptualize that? Now, in the question of illegal aliens, it's very difficult to make this, because illegal aliens don't necessarily have human rights, because illegality is determined by nationality laws and citizenship laws. But there are also interesting cases that enabled us to make arguments. I don't want to really go into this notion of ruptures, citations, iterations, the engaging with the Judith Butler and speech acts theory machinations, but it is important to go through that. The theoretical arguments are really important to go through it, because also it is not done in citizenship. In theorizing citizenship, this is not done. Mainstream theorizing of citizenship is not going to think about, most of the time, performativity and enactment aspect of it, let alone subjectivity. Nor will they be interested in looking at, thinking about this notion of ruptures, what does it mean to interrupt the legal process. Nor will they look at the whole machinery of speech acts, citations, repetitions, when do we know when something new happens. To me, all of which are absolutely fundamentally significant also in places like Palestine. And I'd like to come back to that, because we're talking about discussion for us. Now, some of the principles are, for example, we say that in investigating acts specifically, where do you start? If thinking about acts of citizenship is different than status and habitus, where do you start? So one of the methodological principles that we have come about, we have really, I think, invested time, is that one starts with an event. Events are really significant. Events in which bodies are put on the line and bodies take risks. That's really important. And by taking risks, rupture, interrupt the given order of things. Certainly, the first intifada and second intifada could be creatively thought through as acts of citizenship, acts of Palestinian citizenship. It involved violence, but that violence also had certain logic to it, and certain method to it, and certainly it was not random, and all the things that are associated with sort of non-political activity. Then I'm placed also in certain platforms. Do you then think suicide bombing is an act of citizenship? So we can come to that and discuss that. I have actually written a paper about that, whether we should think about suicide bombing is an act of citizenship. Tricky and very dangerous, but it requires the risk on the part of researchers to think through whether it is to be included or not. So then the question of the event and the invention of an event, even if one does not accept suicide bombing as an act of citizenship, rejects it categorically, one cannot deny the fact that it invented a repertoire, it invented a form of action through an event. And this is the interesting thing about events, that it creates a repertoire and then it becomes citable, iterable, repeatable, and nameable. And certainly Intifada has also done that. Then it becomes also questions, what other repertoires we are able to invent, what repertoires are being invented today in Palestine, becomes to me like a significant question. So number one is to start with events that stopped everyone in their tracks and made them think, oh, this is new. Something new has begun here. Sometimes, though, it doesn't happen at the moment. And I will come to that. So when we say events, the requirement on researchers is not within 10 minutes of the event to be able to identify. Sometimes it takes years. So hence significance of also historical work. Some events that has instigated certain repertoires in the past, it takes decades to identify them. Actually something new happened then. And there was a new repertoire, new way of acting. It shifted. Something new began. From hindsight, you identify that. So the question of event is really significant. So it's a temporal category, but also it's a spatial category, event. So thinking through the event is important. The second one, the important, site of contestation. When site is not a place or a space. So to give you an example, like city of Ramallah is a place. It has spaces in it. Some spaces are dangerous. Some spaces are risky. I'm just giving, some spaces are enjoyable. Some spaces are space of pleasure, and so on. So it's a place within which there are various categories of spaces. But a site, something becoming a site of contestation, becomes through the confluence of it becoming the place and space of an event. So events produce sites of contestation. So we cannot think of sites outside what events produce those sites. But once events produce sites, those sites don't have inherent qualities, like unlike places and spaces, spaces of pleasure in Ramallah can change over time. Their symbolism, who frequent them, and so on. But once a site becomes a site, it becomes invested with symbolism, what it indicates, and so on. So for example, I don't know from history, but I am sure there is a site when Intifada began. It can be identified. Because that's when that rupture of an event was enacted. We can identify that. So a site becomes significant, and then that site itself becomes cited and repeated. There are other sites of confrontation can come into being. So this is an important aspect of thinking through acts. So if you're beginning to think acts of citizenship, you need to first start with an event, articulating eventness of the event, when it happened, how it happened, and so on. And what site it produces, the next question. What symbolism has been invented with that eventness of the site? That's important. And this is all just really as beginning to theorize what act of citizenship came into being in that particular space. And then site also is not enough, because events, when they rupture given order of things, with their eventness, render a particular place into a site where it's symbolically invested. They also trigger scales of reaction to it. Scale is never local, never global, never. It just traverses these scales. So one has to understand what was the scale of this. Scale of Intifada truly was local, global at the same time, and national, and regional. But it traversed them. Some of them retain very local scales. Some of them become regional. Some of them instantly are global, that site of contestation. We can give many examples of that, not necessarily from acts of citizenship, by the way. Something that over the years I've learned, I draw out examples from acts that I don't necessarily mean that they are acts of citizenship, then I get into trouble later. But you said that this was an act of citizenship. Well, actually I didn't. That was an example of an act. Charlie Hebdo killing 12 journalists. I will categorically deny that that was an act of citizenship. I will not be persuaded. That form of violence was not an act of citizenship. but it was an act. It was an act. There was an eventness to it. It signified a particular site. It was global, but it was a pure act of violence. So then that means I'm able to distinguish under certain circumstances an act of violence from an act of citizenship. But I can't do that categorically. Only in certain specific cases, acts, we are able to do that. Then, finally, the fourth category, events, sites, scales, the fourth category of thinking, and thank God this is not a trinity, this aspect of thinking methodologically about acts. There is a fourth one, and the fourth one is also a category of temporality. How long does an act endure? Now this is very interesting, because sometimes people think that acts are one-off things. And therefore, if they don't have enduring qualities, they can't be properly really citizenship, because citizenship has to endure. It has to also to be transferred from generation to another generation. That's only when we can say that we have contributed to something larger than ourselves. And it is true. There is certain durability, endurance to act. So one has to articulate, for example, this young man buying lands with money he didn't have illegally and being imprisoned. Do we really think of that? Does it have durability? Is it repeatable? I mean, is it really a good repertoire? Can we repeat it? Can we go into other auctions and bid and buy things and it has a value? These are open questions. I'm not sure. So in that sense, maybe it's a weak act of citizenship. Maybe it's a random act of citizenship. Maybe we shouldn't think of it as also an act of citizenship, but it's an act of civil disobedience, as the man himself argued. But these are analytical questions that has to be like empirically investigated, sociologically interrogated, anthropologically researched, politically thought through. So that's why I call these principles as methodological. But in all of this, one principle really is significant, and what I call this activist citizenship or activism in citizenship. Now, there is a venerable term in particular political theory, but especially this is one gift of French political theory to the world. And that word is active citizenship, and it comes from French Revolution, and clearly delineating the value of being an active citizen. That means the second concept in our idea of subjectivity, that citizenship held passively perhaps is not worth holding. Because it is held passively, is not worth much. It has to be actively practiced, therefore the significance of active citizenship. Now I wanted to play a little bit with French theory. What are we going to do with people who are actively engaging with citizenship that they don't have? Because French citizenship, when it's a French theory making that distinction, its idea is that those citizens who already have the legal status of citizenship, amongst them who are holding it passively, in some way should be held in contempt. Even if it doesn't say explicitly say so, there is an implicit, there is a contemptuous attitude toward those who hold it passively. Citizenship is a value we inherit from the Enlightenment with French Revolution, and those who just don't actively practice it, they are doomed to lose it. So for example, one of the things important about post-Charlie Hebdo French demonstration in Paris was universally valued precisely because of that. You'll see many people saying that the real value of that 1.7 million citizens of all types took to the streets and reminded themselves of the significance of active citizenship, that it is only by, but it doesn't say anything about the non-citizens. So I played with that and said, well, the non-citizens, when they practice their citizenship, actively engage, perform it, we shall call that activist citizenship. When they engage, activist citizenship. So I added IST to active to make that inflection. So that's really captures quite well. So when we talk about activist citizenship, taking it to that new level, it works very nicely with also now the entire social movements literature, activists, transnational activists, and so on. It raises questions to what extent and when we should call transnational activists as activist citizenship. And the question arises, is citizenship the proper category for transnational activists when it traverses various legal orders, several countries, they are not citizens of any one of them? To what extent it should be considered citizens? Does human rights protect them? It raises all these questions. So just to wrap up, and considering that I have really merely scratched the surface, but I hope I have provided, a background, a context in which why this way of thinking about citizenship came about, what we try to do with this way of thinking about citizenship, who does it address? I think it addresses Palestinians, it addresses Roma, it addresses sex workers, it addresses Kurdish people, it addresses indigenous people, it addresses illegal immigrants, it addresses refugees, it addresses people who are practically denied of citizenship status in wherever they happen to find themselves, though in different ways. Palestinians are not Kurds, Kurds are not indigenous people, recognizing these fundamental differences. So the point is, how they perform citizenship is to be studied, needs to be studied. And then poses the question, should we not consider them activist citizens? Now this way of citizenship, lest you think mainstream or accepted or even known, is not the case. This is very important to understand. So I'm speaking from the margins about the margins. Let's not make mistakes about that. In many places I go, there will be people, whether it's in New York, whether it's in Paris, whether it's in Rome, whether it's in Berlin. This way of thinking about citizenship is, if not completely alien, at least not recognizable to many citizenship studies scholars. That's important. But this is also a political choice. I don't necessarily find it problematic to speak from the margins when I'm speaking to margins. That to me does not constitute an analytical or political question, but it is a problem when you begin to think that this is how citizenship studies operates. It doesn't. It's still, if I were to map citizenship studies today, predominantly the mainstream thinking is still considering citizenship as status, passport rights, distribution of rights in given jurisdictions, and analysis stops there. And another group that looks at subjectivity and habitus is another marginal group, but it is growing and it has significant following, significant practitioners, as it were. And the ACT is definitely in the margins and minority. And that's important to put on the table. So this is the background and the context of a sort of different way of thinking about citizenship. So maybe in the second part of the seminar we can switch to thinking about in areas that how this kind of thinking speaks to what perhaps its shortcomings. Even you can say that on the basis of what I have said, there are shortcomings. You didn't address this, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that. So we can think creatively how we may also address, for example, questions of Palestinian citizenship in terms of acts of Palestinian citizenship. So maybe I should stop there, and then we should just move on to that discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Engin, for this very enlightening presentation and very detailed one. Okay. So now I leave the floor to the discussion, to the question that you might have, the input you will have for sure.